Loose professor tries to humiliate Robert Davies, has no idea. He's a math genius. Part 1. The large classroom at Oxford University buzzed with excitement on a crisp autumn morning. Students shuffled into their seats, whispering about the special guest who would be speaking today. Robert Davies, the famous tech company CEO, stood quietly at the side of the room, reviewing his notes one last time. Professor William Edwards strode into the room with his usual serious expression. He was known throughout the university for his brilliant mind and his equally harsh teaching methods. Many students feared his calculus class and even more feared being called to solve problems at the board. "Good morning," Professor Edwards announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. "As you know, we have Mr. Robert Davies with us today to discuss technology innovation. But before we hear about phones and computers, I think it would be good to test if our guest remembers his basic mathematics." The students exchanged worried glances. This was typical of Professor Edwards, trying to make important visitors look foolish. Poor Mr. Davies, they thought. He probably hadn't done proper mathematics in years. Robert smiled politely, setting his prepared talk aside. "I'd be happy to try, Professor." Professor Edwards turned to the whiteboard with a slight smile playing on his lips. With quick movements, he wrote a complex calculus problem that covered nearly half the board. It involved multiple integrals with strange boundary conditions, the type of problem that appeared on his most difficult exams. "This problem gave my best students trouble last term," Professor Edwards said, stepping back to admire his work. "Perhaps you could show us how you would approach it?" The room fell completely silent. In the front row, a young man named Thomas looked down at his notebook, too embarrassed to watch what was about to happen. Another student, Mary, bit her lip nervously. Robert studied the board quietly for a moment. Professor Edwards crossed his arms, clearly enjoying what he assumed would be an awkward moment for the successful businessman. But then something unexpected happened. Robert picked up a marker and approached the board with calm confidence. He studied the problem once more, then began to write. His first few steps followed the standard approach that any good student might take. But then, about halfway through, he paused. A small smile appeared on his face as if he had just recognized an old friend. "If we look at this from a different angle," Robert said quietly, "we can use a substitution here." He wrote down a formula that made several students gasp. It was elegant and completely unexpected. Professor Edwards uncrossed his arms, his smug expression fading. He leaned forward, suddenly interested. Robert continued working through the problem with steady hands and clear thinking. Where most people would get lost in the complex calculations, he seemed to see a simpler path. His method revealed a solution that even Professor Edwards hadn't considered. The students watched in amazement as this supposed just a businessman transformed the impossible-looking problem into something beautifully ordered. Even Thomas, who had been too embarrassed to watch at first, now stared with wide eyes. Robert circled his final answer and stepped back from the board. The room remained silent, but now for a completely different reason. Even Professor Edwards seemed at a loss for words. Finally, the professor cleared his throat. "That's correct," he admitted, studying the solution. "But your approach, I've never seen this particular substitution used for this class of problem." Robert nodded. "I encountered something similar during the International Mathematics Olympiad many years ago. Sometimes looking at problems from unusual angles reveals hidden patterns." The students looked at their guest with new respect. This wasn't just any tech company CEO. This was someone who truly understood the foundations of the work he did in the world. Part 2. Professor Edwards stared at Robert with newfound curiosity. The classroom remained silent as the students tried to process what they had just witnessed. A business leader had just solved one of their professor's most challenging calculus problems with elegant ease. "Would you mind explaining your approach again?" Professor Edwards asked, his tone noticeably softer than before. "I believe we all could benefit from understanding your method." Robert nodded and turned back to the board. "The trick is to see the hidden symmetry in the problem," he explained, pointing to a particular part of the equation. "Most people try to solve this head-on, but if we rotate our perspective slightly, a simpler path appears." As Robert walked, Through his solution step by step, the students furiously took notes. In the middle row, a young woman named Elizabeth felt a surge of excitement. Mathematics had always been difficult for her, but watching Robert break down the complex problem made something click in her mind. "It's like looking at a maze from above instead of trying to solve it from inside," Robert continued, drawing a simple diagram to illustrate his point. "Sometimes stepping back gives us the clarity we need." Professor Edwards nodded thoughtfully. His plan to embarrass the guest speaker had completely backfired, but he found himself genuinely engaged in the mathematical discussion that had emerged. This was no longer about proving superiority. It was about learning. "Where did you study?" "Mathematics, Mr. Davies?" Professor Edwards asked. "Cambridge," Robert replied with a small smile. "Though I eventually moved into computer science and business, mathematics was my first love. The patterns and elegance of it still guide my thinking every day." A student named James raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, could you explain how this kind of thinking helps in running a technology company?" Robert smiled warmly at the question. "Mathematics teaches us that problems often have multiple solutions, and the most obvious path isn't always the best one. In business, just like in calculus, creative approaches can transform seemingly impossible challenges into manageable ones." He walked back to the problem on the board. "Take this equation. At first glance, it looks overwhelming. But once you identify the key pattern, everything falls into place. The same principle applies when facing business challenges or developing new technologies." Elizabeth raised her hand next. "Did you always find mathematics easy?" she asked, her voice slightly shaky. Robert laughed gently. "Not at all. I struggled terribly with calculus in my first year. I nearly gave up several times." "What changed?" Elizabeth asked, surprised by his answer. "I had a tutor who showed me that understanding the why behind the formulas was more important than memorizing steps," Robert explained. "Once I grasped the underlying principles, the details became much clearer." Professor Edwards watched this exchange with interest. He had spent years believing that mathematical ability was simply innate. Either students had it or they didn't. Yet here was someone suggesting that approach and perspective mattered just as much as natural talent. "Perhaps," Professor Edwards said thoughtfully, "we should reconsider how we teach these concepts." The bell rang, signaling the end of the class. Period. Students began gathering their things, but no one seemed eager to leave. The atmosphere in the room had transformed from tense anticipation to genuine intellectual excitement. As Robert prepared to continue with his planned technology talk, several students approached him with questions. Professor Edwards stood back, observing the scene with a mixture of surprise and respect. His attempt to put the guest speaker in his place had instead created an unexpected teaching moment. For the first time in many years, Professor Edwards wondered if perhaps his approach to teaching needed reconsideration. Sometimes, he realized, the most powerful lessons came not from challenging students to breaking point, but from showing them that even the most complex problems could become manageable with the right perspective. Part 3. After the class ended, word spread quickly throughout Oxford University about what had happened in Professor Edwards's calculus lecture. By lunchtime, students from other departments were asking about the tech CEO who had outshined the notoriously difficult mathematics. "Professor." Calcu Roberts' scheduled technology talk in the afternoon attracted triple the expected audience. The lecture hall was packed, with students sitting in the aisles and standing against the walls. Professor Edwards arrived early and took a seat in the front row, his usual stern expression replaced by one of genuine interest. "Today I plan to discuss technological innovation," Robert began, looking out at the eager faces. "But after this morning's unexpected mathematics discussion, I'd like to change direction slightly. Let's talk about how mathematical thinking shapes problem-solving in all fields." For the next hour, Robert shared stories from his career, connecting complex business decisions back to fundamental mathematical principles. He explained how understanding patterns had helped his company survive during difficult economic times, and how approaching problems from multiple angles had led to their most successful products. In the audience, Elizabeth listened intently. After class that morning, she had nearly decided to drop mathematics as her major. The constant struggle with complex concepts had worn her down, and Professor Edwards' harsh teaching style had destroyed what little confidence she had left. But Robert's approach had sparked something new in her, a way of seeing mathematics, not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a tool for understanding the world. When Robert opened the floor for questions, Elizabeth's hand shot up immediately. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice stronger than it had been that morning. "I've been struggling with mathematics for years. Sometimes I think my brain just isn't wired for it. Do you believe anyone can become good at math with the right approach? Or do some people simply lack the natural ability?" The room grew quiet. Many students leaned forward, clearly sharing her question. Robert considered her words carefully before answering. "I believe mathematical thinking is like learning a language. Some people may pick it up more quickly, but anyone can become fluent with practice and the right teaching methods." He walked closer to where Elizabeth sat. "The biggest obstacle isn't ability, it's believing you can't do it. Once that belief takes hold, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy." From his seat in the front row, Professor Edwards shifted uncomfortably. How many students had he dismissed as simply not having what it takes over his years of teaching? How many might have succeeded with a different approach? "Mathematics isn't about getting the right answer through the expected method," Robert continued. "It's about developing a way of thinking that helps you see patterns and connections that others might miss." After the talk ended, a small group of students gathered around Robert, including Elizabeth. Professor Edwards approached slowly, waiting for his chance to speak with the guest who had completely changed his perspective in just one day. When the students finally dispersed, Professor Edwards extended his hand to Robert. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "I invited you here today with less than honorable intentions." Robert smiled and shook the professor's hand. "We all have moments when pride clouds our judgment. What matters is how we respond when we recognize those moments." Professor Edwards nodded thoughtfully. "Would you consider returning to Oxford, occasionally to speak with our students? I believe they could benefit greatly from your perspective, as could I." As they walked together toward the faculty building, they discussed ideas for making mathematics more accessible to students who struggled with traditional teaching methods. For the first time in his 20 years of teaching, Professor Edwards found himself excited about changing his approach completely. Part 4. 6 months after Robert's unexpected visit to Oxford, Professor Edwards' calculus class had transformed completely. Gone was the intimidating atmosphere that had once made students dread entering his classroom. Instead, the room buzzed with active discussions as small groups worked together to solve problems from multiple approaches. Professor Edwards moved between the groups, offering guidance rather than criticism. On the walls hung colorful posters showing different ways to visualize complex mathematical concepts. The change in teaching style had not come easily to him, but the results were impossible to ignore. Test scores had improved dramatically, and course enrollment had nearly doubled. Elizabeth, now in her second year, had become one of the department's most promising students. The confidence she had gained that day watching Robert solve the impossible problem had grown into genuine mathematical talent. She often stayed after class to discuss new approaches with Professor Edwards. "Have you heard the news?" Elizabeth asked one day as she helped the professor prepare materials for the next lecture. "Robert Davies is coming back next week. The university is giving him an honorary degree." Professor Edwards nodded. "Yes, I've been asked to introduce him at the ceremony." He paused, arranging some papers on his desk. "I'm not sure I've found the right words yet." "Just speak from the heart," Elizabeth suggested. "Tell everyone how one class changed everything." The following week, the university's grand hall was filled to capacity for the special ceremony. Faculty members in formal academic robes sat in the front rows while students packed the remaining seats. Robert, dressed in the traditional honorary degree recipient's gown, waited quietly at the side of the stage. When Professor Edwards stepped up to the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. Many students who had experienced his previous teaching methods were still getting used to his transformed approach. 6 months ago, Professor Edwards began, his voice steady. I invited Robert Davies to my classroom with the intention of proving that business leaders had forgotten the foundations of their education. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Instead, he taught me the most important lesson of my career. In the audience, several older faculty members exchanged surprised glances. William Edwards was not known for admitting mistakes. For 20 years, I believed my job was to identify which students had natural mathematical ability and which did not, he continued. I saw struggle as evidence of limitation rather than part of the learning process. Mr. Davies showed me how misguided that approach was. From his place at the side of the stage, Robert listened thoughtfully. He had not expected his visit to have such a profound impact. Since that day, we have completely redesigned our approach to teaching mathematics at Oxford, Professor Edwards said. We now focus on developing mathematical thinking rather than memorizing procedures. We encourage students to find multiple paths to solutions, and most importantly, we believe that every student can succeed with the right support. Dostai, Professor turned toward Robert. The honorary degree we present today recognizes not just Mr. Davies' business achievements, but his contribution to education at this university. In one day, he changed the course of countless students' futures. As Robert stepped forward to accept the degree, the audience erupted in applause. Elizabeth cheered loudly from her seat, remembering how close she had come to giving up on mathematics entirely. After the ceremony, Robert met with a small group of students who had formed a mathematics club inspired by his approach. They proudly showed him their latest projects, including a program that helped first-year students visualize calculus concepts in 3 dimensions. This is remarkable, Robert said, examining their work. You've taken the ideas further than I could have imagined. Elizabeth smiled. You showed us that mathematics isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about seeing problems from new angles and working together to find solutions. Part 5. 5 years passed since Robert's first visit to Oxford University. What began as a simple guest lecture had grown into a complete transformation of mathematics. Education, not just at Oxford but at universities across the country. The Davies approach, as it came to be known, emphasized understanding over memorization, collaboration over competition, and multiple solution paths over single correct answers. On a bright spring morning, Robert returned to Oxford for a special event. The university was opening a new mathematics learning center, funded largely by a generous donation from his company. The modern glass building stood in sharp contrast to the ancient stone structures surrounding it, symbolizing the blend of tradition and innovation that now defined Oxford's approach to teaching. Professor Edwards, now head of the mathematics department, waited at the entrance to greet Robert. Though his hair had grown grayer, his eyes held a youthful enthusiasm that had been absent during their first meeting. Welcome back, Professor Edwards said warmly, shaking Robert's hand. I can't wait to show you what we've built. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Large open spaces filled with comfortable furniture allowed students to work together easily. Interactive displays on the walls showed mathematical concepts in visual forms. In one corner, a group of first-year students worked with 3-dimensional models of complex equations. This is beyond anything I could have imagined, Robert said, taking it all in. And that's not all, Professor Edwards replied with a smile. There's someone special I want you to meet. He led Robert to a small office where a young woman sat, surrounded by research papers. When she looked up, Robert immediately recognized Elizabeth, though she had changed much in 5 years. Dr. Elizabeth Barnes is our newest faculty member, Professor Edwards announced proudly. She's leading our research on new teaching methods for advanced calculus. Elizabeth stood and extended her hand. It's wonderful to see you again, Mr. Davies. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for changing my life that day. I hardly did anything, Robert replied modestly. You found your own path. Not exactly, Elizabeth said. You showed me it was possible. Sometimes that's all someone needs. Later that afternoon, Robert gave a speech at the official opening ceremony of the center. Hundreds of people gathered to hear him, including many students whose lives had been changed by the new approach to teaching mathematics. 5 years ago, I came to Oxford to talk about technology, Robert began. Instead, I found myself in the middle of a much more important conversation about how we learn and how we teach. He paused, looking out at the crowd. I solved one calculus problem that day. But Professor Edwards solved something much more significant. He questioned his own deeply held beliefs and had the courage to change. In the front row, Professor Edwards listened with a hint of emotion in his eyes. The building we opened today isn't just about mathematics, Robert continued. It's about believing that everyone has the capacity to understand complex ideas when given the right support. It's about recognizing that the path to knowledge isn't always straight or simple, and most importantly, it's about the courage to admit when our approaches aren't working and to try something new. After the ceremony, Robert, Professor Edwards, and Elizabeth walked together through the university grounds. Students greeted them, respectfully as they passed, many stopping to thank Robert personally for his contribution to their education. "What's next for you?" Robert asked Elizabeth. "I'm developing a program to bring this approach to schools in disadvantaged areas," she replied. "Every child deserves the chance to see mathematics as something beautiful rather than something to fear." Robert nodded approvingly. "The most powerful change happens when one person shows another what's possible," he said. "That's the true lesson of that calculus problem 5 years ago. It wasn't about who was smarter, it was about showing each other new ways to see." As the sun began to set over the ancient towers of Oxford, the three continued their walk, discussing new ideas and possibilities. What had begun as an attempt at humiliation had grown into a movement that was changing countless lives, one mathematical problem at a time.